to me at this point, the way I'm seeing this, I'm not seeing any quote unquote good guys here. Russia has shown itself to be a challenging actor, to say the least. Putin is one of the richest oligarchs who has sucked his country dry, especially since the liberalization of markets occurred at the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't go through a period of time where they ramped up that oligarchy. They just jumped from no private property 1 minute to suddenly, hey, we're all plutocrats, right? And
with our
so,
help.
like, with our help, and that's where I was leading with. Talk to me about our help, man. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that, to me, it's such a circle jerk. We're the impetus behind each of these things, and then after we create the problem, we're also raising our hand and saying, hey, I think we know how to fix it. It's like, come on,
exactly. Like in the media, you'll hear all this talk of Russian oligarchs. And in fact, that's a word that's exclusively used to talk about Russian billionaires, but basically it's just their billionaire class. We ask ourselves, how do we get from a communist country to a full-on capitalist oligarchy? Well, the answer is shock therapy. And shock therapy was the economic policy that the United States prescribed to post-Soviet Russia in order to liberalize markets, to privatize the economy, to introduce democracy. But what that ended up doing was the Russian state sold off a bunch of assets to like six guys and their buddies, and they ended up owning the entire country. And the Russian people have suffered for it. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the standard of living dropped dramatically. Alcoholism increased dramatically. All these social ills, deaths of despair, things like that, that became more commonplace. And in fact, I didn't know this until recently, but the referendum in Russia to whether or not to maintain the USSR, to dissolve it, it was overwhelmingly in favor of keeping it in Russia. And even now, a lot of people still have favorable views of the old Communist Party. But things were a disaster in the 90s for Russia, and things were very destabilized. The U.S. helped elect a president who then bombed the Russian Duma, and out of this whole destabilizing period came Vladimir Putin. And one of the things that you'll hear Russians say about Vladimir Putin is that he brought order to chaos. Whether or not you like the way he brought order to that chaos, it's obviously an open question. But for average everyday Russians, their country was falling apart, and for them, it seemed like Vladimir Putin was a sort of way out. And so now you have Putin. In fact, there was recently an article in the Times of London about how the MI6 regrets helping get Putin to power because now he's such a pain in the ass. But the U.S. had an extremely heavy hand in shaping Russian politics throughout the 90s. And so at the dawn of the millennium, Russia emerged, more or less separate from the U.S. influence. There were different sort of tensions that sort of broke it apart. But during the 90s, the United States had its first unipolar decade. By unipolar, I mean that the United States was the only power in the world with I guess the biggest stick that they could wave around to do whatever they want. You saw the Gulf War, you saw invasions in Grenada, Panama, like all sorts of things. And you also saw the beginning of NATO expansion. And NATO expansion is one of these issues that is at the root of this. Along with economic hegemony, the U.S. also desires military hegemony as a matter of strategic defense. The whole world is its sphere of influence, and any threat to that needs to be met. So the U.S. kept trying to expand NATO, and they were actually warned by Russians and even by their own diplomats about how bad of an idea this was. In fact, I have a quote here from the famed diplomat George Kennan. George Kennan is the architect of the U.S. Cold War strategy of containment of the Soviet Union. So he's no anti-imperialist dove. This guy's a diehard Cold Warrior, but his warnings about what could happen if we expand NATO are important. He was asked by Thomas Friedman about NATO expansion. He says, quote, "I think it's the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. It's a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we have always told you that this is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong." And if you look at the news right now, that is what's going on right now. I mean, people are saying that Putin is a new Hitler, hell bent on reconquering the Soviet Empire, reestablishing the Soviet Union, things like that. But we ignore the fact that even as early as 20 years ago, our own people were warning us that expansion of NATO, expansion of U.S. power this far, this close to Russia, will elicit a bad reaction from Russia. And that's exactly what's happened. But regardless, the U.S. kept on. They kept going with that. So you see all of these countries that were once part of the Warsaw Pact and members of the Soviet Union, a lot of them are now liberalized. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So some of these countries wanted that. Some of these countries like the idea of having closer military and economic ties to the West. But that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of destabilizing a nuclear power, and that cannot be ignored. But nonetheless, the U.S. continued to expand. They continued to try and broaden their economic horizons, and in Ukraine, that was long described as a sort of Russian red line. It was understood by even the current CIA director, William Burns. WikiLeaks leaked a cable where when he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and the cable was called "Niet means Niet," Russian red lines on NATO enlargement, and it really just reiterated a lot of what Kennan said. It said that if we keep meddling in Ukraine, if we keep trying to pull Ukraine from Russia, Ukraine has internal divisions that could cause something to happen. And whatever happens, Russia will have to make a decision about whether or not to intervene. And Burns ends this by saying that's a decision that Russia does not want to have to make. And this was in 2008, I believe, early 2008. But later that year, the Bush administration announced plans to integrate both Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. That's bad policy. But neither of them were officially admitted yet. But in 2013, 2014, those events came to a head with the Maidan protests and the 2014 overthrow. And I can talk about that in a little bit more detail if you'd like.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm thinking about here is obviously, I watch people. I mean, I know economics. That's what I know. And when I talk about it, I talk about it with a lot of because I think I know what I'm talking about. And this is an area that I think a lot of people, it depends on what they've read and where they got it from. They have a very jaded, very, filtered view that is not full. It's not complete. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to present several angles of this. And to me, this is important stuff here. So please do dive deeper into that.
Right. So, like I said, you have the National Endowment for Democracy and other U.S. organizations pouring money into Ukraine, trying to fund media organizations, trying to build constituencies for U.S. policy, funding NGOs, things like that. And then right when you have Yanukovych reject the IMF EU proposal and accept the Russian proposal, a wave of protests took over the country. They started marching in the square, calling Yanukovych a corrupt or a Russian stooge or things like that. And the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED and the USAID, all of those organizations that were funded by the U.S., they participated in the protests. They actively supported these protests. In fact, John McCain, he personally flew to Ukraine to stand in front of like the Maidan Square and say, yes, the U.S. supports the Ukrainian people. Like, we want you to change your government and do all sorts of things. But in the background, you have Obama officials and other people like McCain. They're talking to groups of rich investors. There was a video I linked in the Fair article of Victoria Nuland, who was the Undersecretary of State for East European Affairs. I can't remember the exact title, but she was top level Obama State Department official, and she's here talking to a group of rich people. You can see you got Chevron on like a banner on one shoulder, and like some other major company on the other shoulder, and she's saying like, yes, we support Ukrainians. We support them because they need to make necessary changes to their economy so they can be a real democracy. And so that gives you an idea of where their headspace is at. And she was bragging about how much support that the Ukrainian opposition has from the U.S. That's where she mentioned that $5 billion figure, and that's a lot. But these protests continued, and about 3 weeks before the president was overthrown, there was a leaked phone call. It's widely assumed that Russia leaked it. I mean, who else would have the capability, or who else would have the interest in doing that? But we don't know for sure. But yep, this is it. Yeah, you have Victoria Nuland talking with U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, about who should be in the government, who needs to be in the government, how this far right guy, he should be outside of the government, but he should be talking with these guys every day, like 4 times a week. I think she said. So they're planning the future government before the current government has even fallen. And 3 weeks later, the person that they designated as the guy, or our guy, a man named Arseniy Yatsenyuk, he was made prime minister right after the coup. Lo and behold. But of course, this was downplayed in U.S. media. Nuland's call, it was in it. She said, "Fuck the EU," when talking about how like they were going to go behind the EU's back and do this coup without them because they weren't supportive of it. The European Union understood that, well, if you mess with Russia's breadbasket, there might be long-term consequences. But the States didn't care. We went ahead, did it anyway. And so the protests continued. And then after a massacre, the Snipers Massacre, which is a whole other strange topic that we could get into. But after that massacre, Yanukovych was forced to flee the country. The Ukrainian parliament unconstitutionally removed him and replaced him. And a few weeks after that, out of nowhere, Ukraine adopted the IMF policies. They started cutting heating subsidies. They started cutting back on the private sector, but they got that big IMF loan. And this is key because this is the root of the conflict that's going on now. There was a rebellion against the coup government in eastern Ukraine. Now, in the east of Ukraine, it's closer to Russia, and they have more ethnic ties, more linguistic ties, and they generally feel closer to Russia. And so they preferred the Yanukovych government. They preferred his policies towards Russia. And so they rebelled. They declared themselves an independent, 2 independent republics, actually. And the new Ukrainian government, they cracked down hard. At the vanguard of the crackdown was what was called the Azov Battalion, a group of far-right neo-Nazi extremists whose neo-Nazism was useful to the United States and the people who backed them because it meant that they were anti-Russia. And so you had this brutal fighting in the East, and eventually you had it sort of congeal into a stalemate. All sides agreed that, yes, it's time to give these areas some limited degree of autonomy in exchange for reincorporating them back into Ukraine. Now, these areas asked Vladimir Putin to officially recognize them. He didn't do that. He said that you guys should follow the peace accords. These were called the Minsk Accords. They were signed in Belarus. But these peace agreements, they were never implemented by Ukraine. And the United States never pushed Ukraine to implement them.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern time.